"I'm a virgin, and you need a wife," declared the schoolteacher to the giant cowboy. That's what stopped the whole church meeting cold. Dust from the street drifted in through the open doors. The gossiping women froze mid-whisper. The railroad man's smile went stiff. She was just a schoolteacher fighting to keep her job and her good name. He was the quiet rancher everyone knew could break a horse with one hand. But behind her bold words lay a secret one that could take his land, his water, and his future. If the wrong man found out first, the railroad's already sharpening its knives. The town's ready to turn, and winter's coming fast. Somewhere beyond the snow line, a widow holds the one paper that could save them both, or ruin them for good. Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The church fell so quiet that Clara could hear the oil lamp flames sputtering. Her words hung in the stuffy air like smoke, and her cheeks burned hot enough to match the kerosene glow. Through the haze of her mortification, she saw Mrs. Grover's mouth drop open, while Mrs. Fitch clutched at her collar as if she might faint. Mason Cole recovered first, his polished manner cracking just enough to show surprise before smoothing over. "Miss Whitcomb, this is hardly the I am addressing Mr. McCrae," Clara cut in, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. She turned to face the tall figure at the back of the church, forcing herself to meet those dark eyes. "Sir, these people would ruin my reputation over imagined impropriety with a freight clerk I've spoken to exactly twice about shipping textbooks. But if marriage is what it takes to prove my moral character, then I offer myself as a wife." The wooden pews creaked as everyone twisted to stare at Zeke McCrae. He stood absolutely still, hat in his hands, his expression unreadable in the shadows. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting both his Blackfoot features and the intensity of his gaze. "Miss Whitcomb." His voice was deep and quiet, yet it carried clearly. "You don't know me. I know you're honest," she replied, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "I know you keep your word. I know you've never joined in when others gossip. And I know that right now, I need a husband more than I need to follow the usual courtship customs." Someone in the crowd, it sounded like old Mr. Peterson, let out a shocked cough. Clara ignored it, keeping her focus on Zeke. His calloused fingers worked slowly around the brim of his hat. "A marriage should be more than convenience," he said carefully. "Yes, it should." Clara lifted her chin. "But right now, these people would take my livelihood and my good name over whispers and lies. I'm offering you the truth of who I am, an honest woman who takes her duties seriously. I would be a faithful wife, keep a good home, and respect your ways." She paused, then added more softly, "And I would never shame you by breaking my word." Reverend Wallace cleared his throat. "This is most irregular. I accept." Zeke's words cut through the minister's protest like a knife through butter. He stepped forward, his boots striking solid against the wooden floor. "If the lady is willing, I'll marry her." Mason Cole's smooth facade cracked further. "Now see here, McCrae. No, sir, you see here." Zeke's tone remained level, but there was steel beneath it. "You've all gathered to judge this woman's character. She's shown more of it in the past 5 minutes than I've seen from some folks in 5 years of knowing them." His dark eyes swept the room. "She's offered marriage, proper and legal, in front of witnesses and her minister. I've accepted. Unless someone has proof of actual wrongdoing, that should settle the matter of her fitness to teach." Clara felt lightheaded, with relief and terror combined. She watched Zeke cross to stand beside her, his tall frame casting a protective shadow. Up close, she could smell leather and horses on his clothes, could see the sun-weathered skin at his neck above his clean but worn collar. Reverend Zeke addressed the minister directly. "We'll need you to publish the bans. 3 weeks should satisfy propriety. Reverend Wallace looked between them, then at his deacon's wife, who was still gaping like a landed fish. Yes, I suppose that would be proper. Now, hold on. Mason Cole stepped forward, all smooth concern. Surely we should discuss theirs. Nothing to discuss. Clara found her voice again, stronger now, with Zeke beside her. Unless you're suggesting Mr. McCrae isn't a respectable property owner and taxpayer. Cole's jaw tightened. They all knew Zeke's ranch was one of the most prosperous in the area, his water rights secure through both territory law and tribal treaty. Attacking his standing would open up questions the railroad man clearly didn't want to address. Of course. Not, Cole said finally. I merely thought. Given your Eastern background, my background is my own business. Clara replied firmly, and my future is now settled. She turned to Zeke, her heart fluttering as she met his steady gaze. If you'll excuse me, Mr. McCrae, I should head home. There are lessons to prepare for tomorrow. The hint of a smile touched his lips. I'll walk you home, Miss Wickham, if you permit. Mrs. Grover made a small choking sound, but Clara ignored her. Thank you, sir. I'd appreciate that. They left the church together, stepping out into the cool evening air. The stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Suddenly, uncertain what to say to the man she'd just publicly strong-armed into marriage, Zeke solved the problem by speaking first. You're either the bravest or the most foolish woman I've ever met. His tone held no judgment, just quiet assessment. Clara let out a shaky breath. At the moment, I'm not entirely sure which it is myself. That earned her another slight smile. We should talk about this properly. Tomorrow, if you're willing. I'll come by the school after lessons. Yes, she agreed softly. We have much to discuss. They walked the rest of the way in silence, their shadows stretching long before them in the last light of day. At her door, Zeke tipped his hat with grave courtesy. Good evening, Miss Wickham. Good evening, Mr. McCrae. Clara watched him stride away into the gathering dusk, his tall figure soon swallowed by shadow. Only then did she allow herself to sag against the doorframe, her knees weak as the full weight of what she'd done finally settled over her. She'd solved one problem and created another war, perhaps several others. But as she unlocked her door and stepped inside her small house, Clara couldn't quite regret her rash action. At least now she had a chance to fight back against the rumors. And something in the way Zeke McCrae had stood beside her, solid as a mountain and just as unmovable, gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't made the biggest mistake of her life. The church had grown as quiet as a Sunday morning prayer. But Zeke McCrae's boots made solid thuds against the wooden floor as he stepped forward. His trail coat, worn but clean, hung loose on his broad shoulders. A few bits of hay still clung to the fabric, evidence of his day's work. Clara fought too. Keep her hand steady as he approached. In the lamplight, she could see his face clearly, now weathered by sun and wind. But his dark eyes were calm and steady as they met hers. Miss Whitcomb speaks true, he said, his deep voice carrying too. Every corner of the room. I accept her words. He paused, scanning the gathered faces. We'll be wed soon enough. Until then, seems right, she should keep teaching the children. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Grover pressed her lips together so tightly they nearly disappeared, while her husband, the deacon, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mason Cole stood near the pulpit, his carefully neutral expression cracking just enough to show displeasure before smoothing into a thin smile. Well, Cole said, adjusting his silk cravat, this is certainly an unexpected development. However, I must point out that the school board has no cause to remove a teacher who's now properly engaged. Zeke cut in, his tone mild but firm. unless there's some complaint about her teaching itself. Several parents shook their heads. Even Mrs. Fitch, who'd been so eager to spread gossip earlier, stayed silent. Clara's reputation as a skilled teacher was well known. It was only her personal life they'd gathered to judge. Reverend Wallace cleared his throat. Given these unusual circumstances, perhaps we should adjourn for the evening. We can discuss school matters at the regular board meeting next month. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers following Clara as she gathered her shawl. Zeke waited by the door, hat in hand. "Miss Whitcomb, may I walk you home?" She nodded, acutely aware of the eyes watching them. The October wind bit sharp when they stepped outside, carrying the crisp scent of approaching snow. They walked in. Silence until they'd put some distance between themselves and the church. "Mr. McCrae," Clara began, but he held up a hand. "Need to explain something to you," he said quietly. "Wasn't just kindness made me accept your offer." Clara's steps faltered slightly. "Oh," Zeke slowed his pace to match hers. "My ranch's main well draws from Cottonwood Creek, same stream that runs under school property." He glanced at her. "Railroad's been buying up water rights all through the territory. Without a legal spouse to co-file a claim, my rights ain't as secure as they could be." Clara stopped walking entirely, stunned by his frankness. "You're saying you need a wife to protect your water supply?" "Yes, ma'am, that's the truth of it." He turned to face her fully. "Figured you deserve to know my reasons, same as I know yours. This way, you keep your post and good name. I keep my water rights." Seemed fair. The wind whipped at Clara's skirts as she considered his words. The arrangement made sense, perhaps too much sense. "Mr. McCrae, I appreciate your honesty. And, yes, I agree to your terms if it will indeed silence these rumors." They resumed walking, the boarding house's lights now visible ahead. Clara's mind raced with questions, but one pressed forward. Why did Mason Cole seem so displeased with our arrangement? Zeke's jaw tightened slightly. "Railroad's been trying to get control of Cottonwood Creek for months. Marriage claim makes it harder for them to challenge my rights." They reached the boarding house steps. Light spilled from the windows, and Clara could hear Mrs. Peterson's rocking chair creaking inside. Zeke removed his hat, holding it properly. "I'll call tomorrow afternoon if that suits?" he asked. "Yes, after classes end would be fine." Clara hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Mr. McCrae, for everything." He nodded once, settled his hat back on his head, and strode away into the gathering darkness. Clara watched until his figure disappeared around the corner before entering the boarding house. Later that night, across town in the telegraph office, Mason Cole stood in the pool of lamplight at the operator's desk. His eyes had narrowed to calculating slits as he composed. His message? The telegraph key clicked steadily, sending his words racing along the wire to his superiors back east. Unexpected complications, stop local rancher. McCrae 2 wed schoolteacher stopwater rights claim to be strengthened. Stope advise on alternate strategy. STOPCO Lee. He set down the pencil he'd been tapping against the desk, a frown creasing his smooth features. The evening's events had thrown a wrench in his carefully laid plans, but he wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Outside the depot, the wind picked up strength, driving the first few snowflakes of the season before it. They swirled past the window like tiny white ghosts, harbingers of the winter to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Clara arrived early to prepare for the day's lessons. Something had shifted in the town's atmosphere. Overnight, Mrs. Grover, usually quick to turn her nose up, offered a prim good morning as she passed. The general store owner touched his hat with newfound respect. Inside the schoolhouse, Clara wrote arithmetic problems on the blackboard, trying to ignore the whispers and meaningful glances exchanged by mothers dropping off their children. Chalk clicked against the slate as she worked, a familiar sound that helped steady her nerves. Miss Whitcomb. Little Sarah Peterson tugged at her skirt. Ma says you're going to be Mrs. McRae soon. Will you still be our teacher? Clara patted the child's shoulder. Yes, Sarah, I'll still be your teacher. The morning passed in its usual routine of reading lessons and sums. When recess came, the children spilled out into the yard like water from a tipped bucket. Clara watched them through the window, their shouts and laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. Tommy Miller, a freckled boy of 10, burst through the doorway clutching a folded paper. Miss Whitcomb, message from the telegraph office. He thrust the note toward her, already turning to dash back outside. Clara unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the neat writing. The message was from Fort Washakie, and with each word, her heart sank deeper. According to the 1871 treaty, it's full. The water rights to the stream belonged to a Blackfoot widow named Nia Running Bird, who was apparently the widow of Zeke's late father's cousin. If Nia filed her claim before they could secure theirs, she pressed her hand against the smooth wood of her desk, steadying herself. This changed everything. Without those water rights, Zeke's ranch would struggle, and their planned marriage of convenience would lose its primary purpose. The afternoon crawled by like molasses in winter. When the last child had gone home, Clara hastily gathered her things and hurried to the livery stable. Mr. Jenkins, the stable master, helped her hitch up a buggy, his weathered face carefully neutral. 2 miles out to the McRae place, he said, handing her the reins. Road's clear enough, though there's weather coming. The buggy wheels rattled over the rutted road as Clara urged the horse forward. Wind whipped at her skirts, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. Fields stretched out on either side, the grass bent and golden in the late afternoon light. Zeke's ranch house came into view. Solid structure of squared logs with a tin roof that gleamed dully in the fading sunlight. Smoke curled from the stone chimney and lamplight glowed in one window. Clara's heart quickened as she drew closer. Though whether from anxiety about the news she carried or awareness of her strange new connection to this place, she couldn't say. Zeke emerged from the barn as she pulled up, wiping his hands on a cloth. His expression shifted from surprise to concern at her unexpected arrival. Miss Whitcomb, we have a problem. She handed him the telegram, watching as he read it, his jaw tightening. Come inside, he said finally. Weather's turning. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Zeke added wood to the cook stove while Clara settled at the scarred wooden table. A pot of beans simmered on the back burner, and a pan of cornbread sat cooling nearby. Nia Running Bird, Zeke said, breaking the silence. I should have thought of her claim. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, setting one before Clara. She's a proud woman, respectable, won't be easily persuaded to give up her rights. What can we do? Find her? Talk to her. He spooned beans into 2 bowls, cut thick slices of cornbread. She winters in the foothills, near the old mission. We'll need to ride out tomorrow before the snow sets in proper. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, studying the man across the table. In the lamplight, his features were softer, though no less determined. His dark hair carried a slight curl behind one ear, and his hands, when they moved, showed the same deliberate grace she'd noticed before. The wind rattled the windows, making the lamp flame dance. Outside, the first snowflakes began to drift past the glass, white and delicate against the gathering dusk. Tell me about her, Clara, said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. What kind of woman is she? Zeke considered, stirring his beans thoughtfully. Raised her family with dignity after her husband passed. Knows every plant that grows in these hills and their uses. Speaks English well, but prefers our people's way of talking. He paused. She was kind to me as a boy, teaching me about the old stories, the sacred places. but she's seen too many promises broken. Clara sipped her coffee, letting the warm liquid chase away the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Will she listen to us? To me, maybe. You, ... He met her eyes across the table. You'll need to prove yourself honest. She's got no patience for those who speak with two tongues. The simple meal continued quietly, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the increasing moan of wind around the eaves. Clara found herself watching Zeke's movements, the way he broke his cornbread into careful pieces, how he held his cup with both hands as if savoring its warmth. This man she'd impulsively chosen as her future husband was still largely a mystery to her, yet there was something reassuring in his steady presence, his straightforward way of facing problems. Whatever came next with Nia running bird, Clara suspected Zeke McCrae would face it with the same quiet strength he showed now. The snow fell thicker outside the windows, each flake catching the lamplight like a tiny star before disappearing into the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, there was warmth and food, and the strange comfort of shared worry over the same problem. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when Clara stood on the boarding house steps, watching Zeke load her trunks into his wagon. Mrs. Peterson, the landlady, hovered nearby with a concerned expression that matched her wringing hands. "It ain't proper, you moving in before the wedding," she whispered to Clara. "These are unusual circumstances." Clara replied softly, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Across the street, Mrs. Grover made no attempt to hide her scrutiny, lips moving as she counted each trunk that went into the wagon. The town was coming alive around them. The blacksmith's hammer rang against his anvil as he paused in his work, offering Zeke a respectful nod. The general store owner swept his porch with deliberate slowness, his eyes tracking their every move. Zeke secured the last trunk with practiced efficiency. "That's all of them?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough for the onlookers to hear. "Yes," Clara answered, clutching her small carpet bag. "The rest can wait until ... later." Until there. Wedding, she meant, though the words stuck in her throat. The ride to the ranch passed in comfortable silence. Clara watched the landscape roll by the golden prairie grass bowing under the autumn wind, the distant mountains wrapped in their first dusting of snow. This would be her home now, this wild and beautiful country. When they arrived, Zeke carried her trunks inside while Clara stood in the ranch house doorway, taking in her new surroundings. The main room was spare but clean, with smooth plank floors that had been swept with careful attention. A single rocking chair sat near the stone fireplace, its wood polished by years of use. Built-in shelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound ledgers whose spines showed the wear of frequent handling. "The loft is yours," Zeke said, indicating the ladder that led to the sleeping area above. "I'll take my bedroll down here by the stove." He paused, then added, "It's not much, compared to what you're used to." Clara shook her head. "It's honest, and that means more than fancy trappings." She ran her hand along the kitchen table's smooth surface, noting the careful repairs that spoke of Zeke's dedication to maintaining what he had. As evening approached, they sat at the table with cups of coffee, discussing their journey ahead. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls as Zeke spread out a worn map. "Elias Ward might know where to find Nia," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "He rode with my father back in the day, knows the old trails better than anyone still living." "Where is he now?" "Keeps a cabin about 5 miles north, near Thunder Creek. He doesn't come to town much anymore. His leg gives him trouble in cold weather." Zeke looked up at the ceiling, considering. "The river will start freezing soon. We need to move quick if we're going to make it to the winter camp." Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, absorbing its warmth. "I can arrange for Mrs. Henderson to take my classes. She substituted before when I had fever last spring. 3 days, Zeke said firmly. We'll leave at first light. The journey to the reservation takes 4 days in good weather could be. Longer with snow coming, Clara nodded, mentally listing what she would need to prepare. The school records would need organizing, lesson plans left for Mrs. Henderson, and parents notified of her absence. I'll speak to the school board tomorrow, she said. They'll need to approve the substitute. I'll ride out to see Elias in the morning, Zeke replied. He might not welcome unexpected visitors, but he'll talk to me. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the eaves. Clara shivered, thinking of the journey ahead. She was no stranger to hard work, but days of winter travel would test her endurance. Zeke must have noticed her concern. We'll pack warm, he said. I've got extra buffalo robes, and the wagon can be covered against the worst of the weather. I'm not afraid of the cold, Clara said, lifting her chin. I'm more worried about what we'll say to Naya when we find her. Why should she help us? That's why you need to come along, Zeke said quietly. Naya respects honesty above all else. She wants to see for herself what kind of woman is willing to marry a half-Blackfoot rancher to save a school. Clara met his steady gaze across the table, remembering her impulsive words in the church. She had acted out of desperation then, but now, sitting in this simple kitchen with this thoughtful man, she felt something else, a growing certainty that, whatever their reasons for joining their lives, they could face this challenge together. 3 days then, she said. I'll be ready. The next morning, Clara stood before her class, her hands clasped to still their trembling. Children, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Hartley, who will be teaching while I'm away next week. The widow Hartley smiled warmly at the students, her gray hair neat under a modest bonnet. Good morning, children. I look forward to working with each of you. Little Sarah Miller's hand shot up immediately. Miss Wickham, is it true you're married to the tall cowboy now? Heat crept up Clara's neck. Mr. McCrae and I will be married soon. Yes. My PA says he's half Indian, Tommy Jenkins blurted out. Does that mean you'll live in a teepee, Tommy? Clara's voice was sharp. We don't ask discourteous questions. Mr. McCrae has a proper ranch house, as you well know. Mrs. Hartley stepped in smoothly, directing the children's attention to their arithmetic lesson. Clara silently thanked her with a grateful look. After reviewing the week's lessons with Mrs. Hartley, Clara gathered her shawl and headed to the mercantile. The bell above the door jangled as she entered. Zeke was already there, consulting a list with Mr. Turner. Afternoon, Miss Whitcomb, Mr. Turner called out. Or should I say Mrs. McCraytube? Clara managed a small smile. Miss Wickham is still proper. Thank you. Zeke touched his hat in greeting, then returned to his list. 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of bacon, 5 pounds of coffee beans, 2 tins of matches, ... The store's shelves yielded their necessities. One by one, thick wool blankets, leatherwork gloves, lamp oil, dried beans, and hardtack. Clara added her own selection: soap, writing paper, and an extra tin cup. The bell rang again, and Elias Ward shuffled in, leaning heavily on his hickory cane. His weathered face creased in a smile. Afternoon, folks. Here, tell you're needing a guide to find Nia running bird. If you're willing, Zeke said, turning to face the old scout. We need someone who knows the winter trails. Elias lowered himself onto a barrel near the stove. Early snows up in the foothills could slow us down some. He rubbed his bad leg thoughtfully. But I reckon I can get you there. Nia usually winters her people in Black Bear Valley near the hot springs. How long? Clara asked. 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the weather. Elias accepted a cup of coffee from Mr. Turner. Need to leave soon, though? Ice is spreading on the river, and we'll need to cross it twice. They spent the rest of the afternoon loading supplies into Zeke's wagon. The mercantile's back door offered some privacy from curious townsfolk, though Clara noticed Mrs. Grover walking past twice, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Back at the ranch, Clara helped Zeke check and oil the leather tack while he inspected every buckle and strap. The barn's familiar sense of hay and horse surrounded them as they worked. "Your mount's ready," Zeke said, nodding toward a gentle-looking bay mare. "She's steady on mountain trails. I've packed an extra saddle blanket for warmth." Clara ran a hand along the mare's velvet nose. "Does she have a name?" "Rosie. My mother named her before she passed." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Clara busied herself with checking the saddlebags, making sure everything was secured properly. Evening found them in the ranch house kitchen. Clara at the table, writing by lamplight while Zeke cleaned his rifle nearby. The scratch of her pen and the soft click of gun parts filled the comfortable silence. "Dear Mary," she wrote to her sister, "I hope this letter finds you well in Massachusetts. You'll be surprised to learn of my engagement, so sudden after my postec. Sudden after my last letter. Mr. McCrae is a respected rancher here. And while our courtship has been brief, I trust in God's guidance of my path." She paused, pen hovering over the paper. How could she explain this arrangement to her proper Eastern sister? The desperate bargain struck in the church, the water rights hanging in the balance, the journey ahead of them. "Having trouble finding the words?" Zeke asked quietly. Clara sighed. How does one explain the unexpected turns life takes? Sometimes it's better to let the truth unfold in its own time. He reassembled the rifle with practiced movements. "Your sister might understand. Better after she meets you both in person." Clara nodded, returning to her letter. She kept the remainder simple, promising more details soon and sending her love. The lamp's flame flickered as she sealed the envelope. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Tomorrow, they would finish the last preparations, and the day after that, they would ride out at dawn. Clara looked around the kitchen at their provisions stacked neatly by the door, at Zeke's rifle propped in the corner, at the maps spread across the table showing the way to Black Bear Valley. She had never imagined herself here, about to embark on a winter journey into the mountains with a man she barely knew. Yet somehow, watching Zeke's sure movements as he checked their gear one final time, she felt strangely calm. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale watercolors, the first light catching on crystalline frost that coated every fence post and blade of grass. Clara pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she watched. Zeke secured the last of their supplies in the wagon. The two bay horses stamped their feet against the cold, their breath forming little clouds in the crisp morning air. Elias Ward sat atop his dung-colored mule, squinting at the northern horizon. "Best get moving before that frost melts and turns everything to mud," he called down to them. His hickory cane was lashed to his saddle, and he wore a heavy buffalo coat against the chill. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat, accepting Zeke's steadying hand. The rough wood planks felt cold even through her thick skirts. Zeke settled beside her, gathering the reins in his gloved hands. The wagon creaked as it pulled away from the ranch yard, wheels crunching over frozen ground. They followed Elias as he guided his mule along the old military track. Clara watched the ranch house grow smaller behind them until it disappeared into the rolling prairie. The morning sun did little to warm the air, and she was grateful for the heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Around midday, they passed a string of frozen ponds. Wild geese huddled together on the ice, their gray bodies hunched against the wind. One lifted its head to watch them pass, honking softly to its companions. In the distance, Clara spotted movement a lean coyote pacing them, its tawny coat blending with the winter pale grass. "He's been following since sunrise," Zeke said quietly, noticing her gaze. "Hoping we might leave something behind for him." "I reckon, poor creature must be hungry," Clara replied, though she couldn't help feeling uneasy about those watching eyes. Nature's way, Elias called back from ahead. Everything's harder come winter. Animals know it better than most. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and share a cold lunch of cornbread and dried beef. The coyote kept its distance but remained visible, a shadow moving through the tall grass. Clara stretched her legs, working feeling back into her feet. As she walked beside the wagon, as afternoon faded toward evening, Elias led them toward a stand of cottonwoods near a shallow creek. The trees would offer some shelter from the wind, their bare branches already black against the darkening sky. They made camp efficiently, each person knowing their task. Zeke tended to the horses while Elias gathered dry wood for a small fire. Clara laid out their bedrolls and set coffee to boil in a battered tin pot. The fire's warmth was welcome as night settled around them. Clara sat wrapped in her wool blanket, cradling a cup of hot coffee between her palms. Across the flames, Elias and Zeke spoke in low voices about times past. "Your father was a good man," Elias was saying. "Understood the old ways better than most white folks. Treated the Blackfoot fair even when others didn't." Zeke nodded, firelight playing across his features. "He taught me their language early. Said a man should know how to speak proper to his kin. I, and your mother's people, respected him for it. Not many settlers bothered to learn the tongue or honor the old agreements." Elias sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Partly why. I reckon Nia might listen to you about this water rights business. You carry your father's name, and that still means something to the people." Clara listened intently, watching Zeke's face as he absorbed these words. She had known of his mixed heritage, of course everyone in town did, but hearing him speak of it now, she began to understand how deeply those roots ran. The cold was seeping up from the ground despite her blanket. Clara shivered, and Zeke noticed. "Best turn in," he said. "Long ride tomorrow." They had arranged her bedroll under the wagon where it would be sheltered from any overnight frost. Clara crawled into the narrow space, pulling the blankets close around her. Above, through gaps in the wagon boards, she could see stars scattered. Across the black sky, like chips of ice, the men's voices continued for a while, soft and indistinct. Clara caught fragments about old trails and weather signs, about people she didn't know and places she'd never seen. Eventually, the conversation died away, replaced by the quiet sounds of night, the horses shifting at their picket line, the whisper of wind in bare branches, the distant cry of an owl. Sleep was slow to come. Clara lay awake, aware of every unfamiliar sound. The hard ground pressed against her back through the bedroll, and even with the wagon's protection, the cold seemed to find its way through every layer of clothing and blanket. Yet somehow, the discomfort felt as if these small hardships were a necessary part of the journey they'd undertaken. She thought of her comfortable bed at the boarding house, of her neat classroom with its rows of desks and smooth blackboard. How quickly life could change course, like a stream diverted by fallen rocks. A week ago, she would never have imagined herself here, sleeping rough under a wagon, traveling toward an uncertain meeting with a Blackfoot widow whose claim could determine all their fates. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, sharp as nail heads driven into the dark vault of sky. Their cold light blurred and faded as Clara drifted into uneasy sleep. The second morning dawned gray and heavy, with promise of snow. Clara woke to find frost had formed intricate patterns on the wagon's underside above her head. The air held that peculiar stillness that often preceded a storm. "Storm's coming," Elias announced as he stirred their breakfast fire. "Best get moving while we can still see the trail." They broke camp quickly, loading supplies with cold-numbed fingers. The first flakes began to fall as they set out, dancing like white feathers in the morning light. By mid-morning, the snow fell steadily, transforming the landscape into a world of white and gray. The wagon creaked forward at a painfully slow pace. The horses plodded through deepening snow, their breaths creating clouds of steam around their queues, around their heads. Elias led them carefully, checking landmarks that were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish in the swirling white. "How much further?" Clara asked, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her lower face. "Not far now," Zeke answered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Nia's people winter in these foothills. They'll have lodges set up in the sheltered valleys." Around mid-afternoon, Elias raised his hand, pointing toward a distant slope. Through the curtain of falling snow, Clara could make out a thin column of smoke rising against the gray sky. As they drew closer, shapes emerged from the whiteness, several lodges nestled against the hillside, protected from the worst of the wind. Outside the largest lodge, 3 women worked at stretched hides, their movements steady and practiced. Despite the cold, several children played nearby, their laughter carrying clearly through the crisp air. They stopped their game to watch the approaching wagon with curious eyes. A tall figure emerged from the lodge, a woman with silver-streaked braids that hung past her shoulders, wrapped in a wool blanket decorated with geometric patterns. Her bearing was regal, her dark eyes sharp and assessing as she watched their approach. Clara knew immediately this must be Nia Running Bird. Zeke drew the wagon to a halt at a respectful distance. He spoke several phrases in Blackfoot, his voice carrying clearly in the snow-hushed air. Clara recognized the careful rhythm of formal greeting, though she couldn't understand the words. Nia listened, her expression unchanged. Switching to English, Zeke gestured toward Clara. "This is Miss Clara Whitcomb, my betrothed. We've come to speak with you about the water rights on Cedar Creek." Nia's hawk-sharp gaze settled on Clara, studying her with frank assessment. "The schoolteacher," she said, her voice deep and measured. "I have heard of you." Clara inclined her head respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." "The water you seek flows through land protected by treaty," Nia stated firmly. "It belongs to my people." "We understand that," Zeke replied carefully. "We hoped to discuss sharing the water rights. The ranch cannot survive without access to Cedar Creek." Nia was silent for a long moment, watching the snow fall. Finally, she spoke. "There is a meadow high in the valley where the stream begins. It has been sacred to my people since before your grandfather's time. Each spring, we gather medicines there that grow nowhere else. But your cattle have begun grazing there, trampling the holy plants." Zeke's shoulders tensed. Clara could see the conflict in his face. That high meadow was crucial summer grazing land for his herd. Losing it could mean the difference between profit and ruin. "If you wish to share the water," Nia continued, "you must keep your cattle from the sacred meadow. This is my condition." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decision. Clara watched Zeke's profile, seeing him struggle between honoring his Blackfoot heritage and protecting his ranch's future. The snow continued to fall around them, adding to the sense of suspended time. "You may camp there," Nia indicated a flat area near a stand of pine trees, "if you wish to consider my words. We will speak again tomorrow." With that, she turned and walked back to her lodge, her blanket trailing in the snow. They made camp, where indicated, working quickly in the failing light to set up shelter from the steadily falling snow. The children from the camp watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. "Oh God." One of the women brought them a gift of dried meat, which Clara accepted with grateful thanks. That evening, huddled near their fire, Clara could see the tension in Zeke's face as he stared into the flames. The sacred meadow represented more than just grazing land. It was a test of where his loyalties truly lay. Would he honor the old ways of his father's people, or choose the path that might ensure his ranch's survival? Elias sat, smoking his pipe, his weathered face thoughtful. "Your father would have known what to do," he said quietly to Zeke. "My father didn't have to choose between tradition and survival." Zeke replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Times were different then." Clara watched the snow fall beyond the firelight, understanding that tomorrow's decision would shape more than just their water rights. It would define what kind of man Zeke chose to be and what kind of future they might build together. The inside of Nia's lodge felt worlds away from the bitter, cold outside. Warm firelight danced on the tanned hide walls and the smell of roasting venison made Clara's stomach rumble. She sat cross-legged on a woven blanket, watching as Nia's daughters tended the cooking fire with practiced ease. "You are welcome here," Nia said, passing Clara a tin plate heaped with steaming meat and golden fry bread. The older woman's movements were graceful, each gesture carrying the weight of ceremony. "We have heard of you, the teacher who opens her classroom to all children." Clara's eyes widened. "Word travels fast on the prairie," she said, accepting the plate with both hands as she'd seen the others do. "The wind carries many stories." Nia settled beside her, her silver-streaked braids catching the firelight. "Some say you teach our little ones to read, even when others object." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks. "Every child deserves learning," she said firmly. "I won't turn anyone away from my classroom." Nia nodded, a slight smile touching her lips. "Is why I asked you to share our meal tonight." Courage comes in many forms. Zeke sat quietly on Clara's other side, his tall frame somehow fitting naturally in the close space. He listened intently as the conversation flowed around him, his eyes following Nia's gestures when she spoke of the meadow. "Come," Nia said, rising smoothly to her feet. "I will show you something." She led them to a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Carefully, she unwrapped it to reveal dried plants and flowers, their colors still vibrant despite the winter season. "These grow only in the sacred meadow," she explained, her fingers gentle as she touched each specimen. "This one heals fever. This brings visions to guide our young men. This one," she held up a delicate purple bloom, "we use to bless new mothers and their babies." Clara leaned closer, drawn by Nia's quiet passion. "They're beautiful," she breathed. "They are more than beautiful," Nia said. "They are our medicine, our connection to the spirits." "But the cattle?" She paused, pain flickering across her features. "Their heavy hooves tear up the earth. They eat the young plants before they can flower. Soon, these medicines will be lost to us forever." Clara glanced at Zeke, seeing the tension in his jaw. The meadow was prime grazing land, especially in the lean winter months when feed was scarce. Losing it would hit the ranch hard. "Some things are worth more than profit," Clara said softly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Some things, once lost, can never be replaced." Nia's sharp eyes studied her face. "You understand then," she said, "why we must protect this place." The meal continued, talk turning to lighter matters. Nia's grandchildren crowded close, asking Clara about her school and the books she taught from. Their eager faces reminded her of her students back in town, all of them hungry for knowledge. Later, in the small canvas tent Zeke had pitched near the lodge, Clara sat wrapped in blankets against the cold. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a pristine silence broken only by the occasional pop of their small fire. "You were quiet in there," she said to Zeke, who sat cleaning his rifle by firelight. He set the weapon aside, his movements deliberate. "Been doing some thinking," he said finally, "about what marriage means. Real marriage, not just papers filed for water rights." Clara's heart quickened. They hadn't spoken of this yet, not really. Everything had happened so fast, her desperate proposal, his acceptance, the rush to find Nia. "What kind of thinking?" she asked. "My father," Zeke said slowly, "he loved two things fierce, the ranch and my mother. Taught me that a man's word is his bond, whether given to his wife or his neighbors." He looked at her directly. "If we do this, if we marry, it needs to be more than just convenience. "What are you saying?" Clara's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm saying maybe Nia's right about the meadow. Maybe some things are worth protecting even at a cost." He shifted closer, his presence solid and warm in the confined space. "And maybe we could build something real between us, if you're willing." Clara studied his face in the dim light. She saw honesty there. And something else, hope, perhaps. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Building something real." "It won't be easy," he warned. "Ranch life is hard. Winter's long. And there's folks in town won't like seeing us together." "I've never much cared what folks like," Clara said, surprising a low chuckle from him. "Besides, I'm stronger than I look. That you are." His hand found hers in the darkness, rough calluses against her softer palm. "Strong enough to stand up to a whole town. Strong enough to speak truth to Nia." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, their joined hands a warm point of connection. Outside, an owl called softly, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. "Tomorrow," Zeke said finally, "I'll tell Nia we accept her terms. The meadow will be protected." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "It's the right thing," she said. "For everyone." "Reckon so," he agreed. "And after? Well, we've got a wedding to plan." The word hung between them, full of possibility. Clara felt something shift in her heart, like a key turning in a long-locked door. This wasn't how she'd imagined finding love in a canvas tent on a snowy night, with a half-Blackfoot rancher who spoke more with his eyes than his words. But somehow it felt right. Morning broke over the winter landscape in a dazzling display of light on snow. The sun transformed every ice crystal into a tiny diamond, making the world sparkle despite the biting cold. Clara emerged from the tent, pulling her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as her breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. Near Nia's lodge, Zeke stood tall against the brightening sky. His broad shoulders were squared with purpose, as he waited for the elder to emerge. When Nia appeared, wrapped in a thick buffalo robe, Zeke removed his hat and spoke with quiet determination. "I've thought on what you said," he began, his voice carrying clear in the still morning air, "about the meadow and its meaning to your people." He gestured toward the distant foothills. "That land will be protected. You have my word, no cattle will graze there." Nia's keen eyes studied his face, reading the truth of his promise. "Your father would be proud," she said finally. He understood the old ways, the balance between taking from the land and protecting what is sacred. Clara watched from near the cooking fire as Nia nodded her acceptance. "I will ride with you to town," the older woman announced. "We will put these promises on paper in the white man's way." Within the hour, their small party was ready to depart. Nia sat astride a sturdy paint mare, its winter coat thick and shaggy. The horse moved with sure-footed confidence through the snow, matching the dignity of its rider. The wagon followed behind, with Elias taking up the rear on his faithful mule. As they traveled, Nia drew her horse alongside Clara's borrowed mount. "I knew Zeke's father when he was young," she began, her voice carrying easily across the space. Between them, it was much like his son, quiet on the outside, but with a fire burning bright within. Throughout the morning, Nia shared stories that painted a vivid picture of the past. She told of how Zeke's father had learned the Blackfoot, ways of his respect for the land and its people. "He would hunt with our men," she recalled, "and always shared his meat with the elders first. He understood honor." Clara found herself entranced by these glimpses into Zeke's heritage. She watched him riding ahead, seeing him now through new eyes, not just as the solitary rancher she'd impulsively proposed to, but as a man bridging two worlds. Carrying the legacy of both his parents, the short winter day began to fade early, and Zeke led them into a shallow draw where the steep banks would shelter them from the relentless wind. They made camp with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role. Elias tended the horses while Naya and Clara gathered wood for the fire. Zeke constructed a makeshift windbreak using canvas and the wagon. After a simple supper of beans and salt pork, they gathered close to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the snow-dusted banks around them. Clara sat on a fallen log, trying to absorb what warmth she could from the fire. The cold seemed to seep up through the ground itself, chilling her despite her layers of clothing. She didn't hear Zeke approach, but suddenly he was there, shaking out an extra blanket. Without a word, he draped it carefully around her shoulders, his hands lingering for just a moment as he tucked it secure. The simple gesture carried more tenderness than any words could have expressed. "Much obliged," Clara murmured, looking up to meet his eyes. The firelight caught the angles of his face, softening them, and she saw the hint of a smile touch his lips before he moved away to check the horses one last time before turning in. Across the fire, Nia watched this quiet exchange with knowing eyes. The elder woman began humming softly, a melody that seemed to blend with the wind and the crackling flames. It was a sound as ancient as the land itself, and Clara felt it seep into her bones, warming her more surely than any blanket could. The night settled around them like a heavy cloak, stars pricking through the darkness overhead. Tomorrow they would reach town, where papers would be signed and promises made official. But here, in this moment, Clara felt as though something just as binding had already taken place, something as old as the hills and as new as the hope growing in her heart. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as their weary party made their final approach to town. Clara's borrowed horse plodded steadily beside the wagon, its hooves clicking against frozen patches of mud. Nia rode tall on her paint mare, drawing curious stares from townspeople who quickly ducked into doorways to whisper. News of their return spread like wildfire through the small community. Clara caught glimpses of faces peering through shop windows, and heard the telltale creak of the telegraph office door as Mrs. Fitch hurried inside, no doubt eager to spread word of their arrival. "Reckon we've caused quite a stir," Zeke said quietly, his eyes scanning the street with cautious awareness. They secured lodging for Naya at the hotel. The first time the establishment had hosted a Blackfoot guest while Elias headed home to his cabin on the outskirts of town. Clara returned to the ranch with Zeke, knowing tomorrow would bring the crucial meeting at the clerk's office. Morning arrived, crisp and clear. Clara smoothed her best dress, fighting down nervous tension, as she prepared for what should have been a simple legal procedure. Zeke waited outside with the buggy, his usual reserve masking any anxiety he might feel. The clerk's office occupied a narrow building between the bank and the mercantile. As they approached, Clara's heart sank at the sight of Mason Cole's sleek bay horse already tied out front. Inside, the railroad agent stood near the clerk's desk, casual as a cat waiting by a mouse hole. "Miss Whitcomb," Cole said smoothly, tipping his hat. "Or should I say, the future Mrs. McCrae." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "I'm afraid there's been a concerning development regarding your eligibility for property ownership." The clerk, Mr. Peterson, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Cole laid out what he called an affidavit. The paper rustled as he unfolded it with deliberate slowness. "This sworn statement," Cole continued, "attests to Miss Whitcomb's questionable character. It seems our schoolteacher has a history that makes her unsuitable, not only for marriage, but for her current position." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That's a lie," she whispered, her voice shaking with fury. The office door swung open again, admitting Mrs. Grover with a self-righteous flourish. She clutched a thick sheaf of papers to her chest like a shield. "I have here," she announced, "a petition signed by concerned parents and citizens." She laid it on the clerk's desk with triumph. "We demand the immediate dismissal of Miss Whitcomb. from her teaching position on grounds of moral turpitude. Mr. Peterson dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, glancing between the documents and the faces surrounding his desk. "This is ... most irregular," he muttered. "I'll need time to review these materials and consult with the school board." Clara felt Zeke's presence behind her, solid as a mountain. His jaw was clenched tight, a muscle working beneath his skin, but he remained silent. His hand found her elbow, gentle but firm, steering her toward the door. "We'll return later," he said simply, his voice controlled despite the anger Clara could feel radiating from him. The office fell quiet as he led her outside into the bitter morning air, leaving Cole's satisfied smirk and Mrs. Grover's righteous indignation behind them. On the boardwalk, Clara's legs trembled beneath her skirts. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd planned, seemed to be crumbling around them. Zeke's hand remained steady at her elbow, but his silence spoke volumes about the gravity of their situation. Clara's hands shook as she folded her cotton, teaching dresses in the fading light. The kerosene lamp cast wavering shadows across the loft's rough-hewn walls as she worked, each creak of the floorboards matching the ache in her heart. From below came the quiet sounds of Zeke moving about the kitchen, but she couldn't bring herself to face him. A tear splashed onto the cream-colored shirtwaist in her hands. She'd arrived at his ranch with so little, and now she'd leave with even less, her reputation in tatters, her teaching position surely lost. Worse, she'd brought trouble to a man who'd only tried to help her. The ladder creaked. Clara hastily wiped her eyes with her sleeve as Zeke's broad shoulders appeared at the top of the loft. "What do you reckon you're doing?" His voice was soft, but held an edge of steel. "What needs doing?" Clara replied, not meeting his gaze. "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for. Cole will use me to destroy your claim, and no." The single word cut through her explanation like a knife. "You're not running." Clara finally looked up at him, startled by the fierce determination in his face. The lamplight caught the planes of his features, highlighting the set of his jaw, and the intensity in his dark eyes. "But the affidavit is nothing but paper and lies." Zeke moved fully into the loft, his presence filling the small space. "Cole thinks he can twist the law in dark corners, but we'll drag this into the light." He reached out and gently took the dress from her trembling hands, setting it aside. "You trusted me enough to make that offer in the church. Trust me now." Clara's throat tightened. "What can we possibly do?" A slight smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Fight. But first, I need to ride out." Before she could protest, he was already moving down the ladder. Clara hurried to follow, nearly stumbling in her haste. By the time she reached the kitchen, Zeke was pulling on his heavy coat. "Where are you going? It's almost dark." To get reinforcements, he paused at the door, turning back to her. "Stay here. Bar the door behind me. I'll be back by dawn." The night crawled by with excruciating slowness. Clara tried to sleep, but found herself starting at every sound: the wind in the eaves, the distant howl of coyotes, the occasional crack on a branch in the cold. She kept the lamp burning low, unable to bear complete darkness. Just before dawn, hoofbeats approached the ranch house. Clara peered through a window, her heart pounding, then sagged with relief at the sight of Zeke's familiar silhouette. But he wasn't alone. She hurried to unbar the door. Behind Zeke rode Nia Running Bird, her silver-streaked hair gleaming in the pre-dawn light. With her were two tall men Clara recognized as her sons, both wearing traditional Blackfoot dress, but sitting their horses with the ease of experienced riders. "Light the stove," Zeke called softly as he dismounted. "We've got planning to do." Soon the kitchen filled with the aroma of coffee and salt pork frying in Zeke's well-seasoned skillet. Clara worked quickly, serving their guests while trying not to stare at the unexpected gathering. Nia's sons, John and Joseph Running Bird, spoke perfect English, but said little. their eyes watchful and intelligent as Zeke laid out several worn documents on the kitchen table. "These are the original treaty papers," Zeke explained, pointing to yellowed pages covered in careful script. "And here, family records showing the connection between Nia's late husband and my father. Cole can't argue with these, not in front of witnesses." "But how will we get witnesses?" Clara asked, pouring more coffee into Nia's cup. "Cole controls the clerk's office. We don't go to the office." Nia spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "We go where all can see and hear. Where truth must be spoken in the light." Zeke nodded. "The church. Sunday service, every important person in town will be there, including Cole, who makes sure he's seen in the front pew each week." Understanding dawned on Clara's face, where he can't hide behind closed doors or legal tricks. "Exactly." Zeke's eyes met hers across the table, warm with approval. "Cole likes to work in shadows. We'll force him into the light." John Running Bird cleared his throat. "The treaty rights are clear. Even their own law must respect them." "And we'll be there," Joseph added quietly, "to make sure they do." Clara looked around the table at these unlikely allies. A half-Blackfoot rancher, a respected tribal elder, her warrior sons, and herself, a Eastern schoolteacher. Together, they made an unusual but formidable team. The sun was fully up now, painting the kitchen in soft golden light. Clara felt hope stirring in her chest for the first time since Cole had produced that damning affidavit. They weren't beaten yet, not by a long shot. Zeke began carefully folding the documents, his movements deliberate and precise. 2 days until Sunday, he said. "We'll need to be ready." Nia reached across the table and took Clara's hand in her weathered one. "You showed courage when you spoke truth in the church before," she said. "Show it again. Standing together, we are stronger than those who would divide us." Clara squeezed the older woman's hand, drawing strength from her quiet confidence. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone. The church bell's deep tone rolled across the frost-dusted prairie, calling the faithful to worship. Inside the white-painted Decity, and wide-planed S, and died. Building sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting rainbow patterns from the modest stained glass onto the wooden pews. The congregation sat in their Sunday best, fanning themselves with worn hymnals despite the morning chill. Reverend Thompson's sermon droned on about obligation and duty when the heavy double doors creaked open. Heads turned as Ezekiel McCrae's tall frame filled the doorway, his dark Sunday coat brushed clean but still bearing the marks of ranch work. Behind him stood Nia Running Bird, her silver-streaked hair bound in neat braids, wearing a beautifully beaded dress that spoke of ceremonial importance. Her sons flanked her like honor guards, their expressions solemn and dignified. Mrs. Grover's fan stopped mid-wave. Mason Cole, seated near the front, straightened in his pew with narrowed eyes. Clara, from her usual seat in the back row, felt her heart quicken as Zeke strode down the center aisle, clutching a worn leather folio to his chest. Reverend Thompson's words faltered as the group reached the front of the church. Zeke cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Reverend, but there's truth needs speaking in God's house today." The minister, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, stepped aside with a small nod. Nia moved forward, her beadwork catching the colored light. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the hushed sanctuary. "I am Nia Running Bird," she began, meeting the congregation's stares without flinching. "My people's rights to the water that feeds your town were set down in the Treaty of 1871. She opened the folio Zeke handed her, the leather, crackling with age, and began to read the carefully preserved words. "The waters of Eagle Creek and its tributaries, from the foothills to the valley floor, shall remain under the sovereignty of the Blackfoot people. Single quotes her finger traced each line as she read. The legal language made powerful by her steady voice. Mason. Cole rose halfway from his seat. This is hardly the time or place. Sit down, Mr. Cole, rumbled Thunder Shield, his deep voice brooking no argument. The railroad agent slowly sank back, his face flushing. Nia produced another document from the folio, a letter, its paper thin with age. Here are the words of James McCrae, Ezekiel's father, written before his passing. She handed it carefully to Zeke, who unfolded it with reverent hands. To my son Ezekiel, he read, his usual quiet voice carrying to every corner of the church. The land we tend has always been a bridge between two peoples. The school meadow, which your mother's people held sacred, I leave in trust to your future family, knowing you will honor both your bloodlines in its keeping. Mrs. Grover pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, her earlier righteousness crumbling as she glanced at her husband. The deacon himself sat with bowed head, as if in prayer or shame. A murmur rose from the congregation, not the angry buzz of previous meetings, but something softer, thoughtful. Clara watched faces change as understanding dawned. This land had never belonged to just one people, one way of life. It had always been meant for sharing, for bringing communities together rather than driving them apart. Mason Cole stood again, his smoothness cracking. These documents require proper verification, but the congregation's growing whispers drowned out his protests, and several of the town council members were already nodding in grave agreement with the evidence presented. The town hall stood silent in the crisp afternoon air, its weathered walls holding back the winter chill. Inside, lamplight gleamed off the polished wooden council table where 12 men and women sat in grave attention. Their faces showed the weight of the morning's revelations still heavy on their minds. Mayor Harrison cleared his throat, his fingers drumming against a stack of documents. Having reviewed the treaty rights presented by Mrs. Runningbird and the personal letters of the late James McCrae, I move we put the matter to vote. He paused, glancing around the table. First, regarding Miss Whitcomb's position at the school. Clara sat straight-backed beside Zeke, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the room, Mason Cole lounged against the wall, his usual smooth confidence now brittle as winter ice. Those in favor of reinstating Miss Whitcomb as teacher, raise your hand. Hands rose one by one. First the blacksmith, then Mrs. Peterson, whose youngest had struggled with reading until Clara's patient help. Even Deacon Grover, after a long moment's hesitation, lifted his hand. Only 2 council members held back, but the majority was clear. Motion carries, Mayor Harrison announced. Making a note in the ledger, Al, regarding the water rights claim, ... The discussion moved to the complex arrangement Nia had proposed, shared access to Eagle Creek's water. With protected status for the sacred meadow, Zeke spoke quietly but firmly about his plans to fence off the ceremonial grounds, explaining how his cattle could still graze the surrounding pastures without disturbing the sacred plants. When the final vote came, it passed without dissent. The mayor's pen scratched across official papers, recording the historic agreement between town, ranch, and tribal land. Mason Cole pushed away from the wall, his face tight with barely controlled anger. The railroad will hear about this obstruction of progress. He snatched his hat from the rack, stalking toward the door. The railroad can read the treaty same as anyone, Zeke said calmly. Good day, Mr. Cole. They watched through the windows as Cole stormed to the depot, emerging shortly with a leather traveling case. The afternoon train's whistle echoed across the valley as it carried him away, black smoke trailing against the winter sky. As dusk settled over the town, the church windows glowed with warm lamplight. Inside, the same pews that had witnessed the morning's confrontation now held a different gathering. Nia Runningbird sat in the front row, her beaded dress catching the light, Beside her, her sons wore their finest clothes, their long hair neatly braided. Townspeople filled the other seats, their earlier tension replaced by the peculiar joy that accompanies the mending of broken things. Clara stood before the altar in a simple white dress borrowed from Mrs. Peterson's daughter. Tiny sprigs of dried winter wildflowers gathered by her students adorned her hair. Beside her, Zeke cut a striking figure in his dark suit, his usually wind-tousled hair smoothed back. Reverend Thompson smiled as he read the familiar words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today, ... The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When Zeke spoke his vows, his deep voice carried to every corner of the church. Clara's "I do" rang clear and true, no trace of the desperation that had marked her first public words to him. After the final prayer, the celebration spilled out into the schoolyard. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between the buildings, their light catching the falling snow. Long tables groaned under the weight of shared dishes, gleaming brown loaves of Mrs. Peterson's bread. Steaming pots of venison stew, provided by Nia's family, and a dozen golden apple pies contributed by the Ladies' Aid Society. Children darted between the tables, their laughter rising into the cold night air. Clara watched from the church steps, her borrowed dress gathered close against the chill. A group of girls, both white and Blackfoot, played together near the schoolhouse, their earlier divisions forgotten in the simple joy of chasing snowflakes. Zeke appeared at her side, offering a tin cup of hot coffee. "Reckon this turned out different than you planned, schoolteacher," he said softly. Clara accepted the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. "Different," she agreed, "but better." She watched as Nia approached a group of town ladies, offering them a taste of traditional fry bread. Mrs. Grover, after a moment's hesitation, took a piece and smiled. "Your father would be proud," Clara told Zeke. "Seeing his land bring people together instead of pulling them apart. Zeke's hand found hers, rough calluses against smooth skin. Together, they watched their unexpected gathering. Ranchers and tribal elders sharing stories over coffee. Children teaching each other games in the falling snow. Townspeople and Blackfoot. Families passing dishes back and forth across the tables. The lamplight caught the silver in Nia's braids as she made her way toward them. She carried 2 plates of pie, steam rising in the cold air. "In our way," she said, handing them each a slice. "Sharing food makes family." Her eyes, wise and knowing, moved from Clara to Zeke. "Today, we are all family." As if to emphasize her words, a peal of laughter rose from the schoolyard. They turned to see one of Nia's granddaughters teaching Mrs. Peterson's youngest how to catch snowflakes on her tongue. Their faces lifted to the star-filled sky. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Clara stood in the doorway, the brass bell heavy in her hand. Her wedding ring caught the light as she raised her arm, sending clear notes ringing across the frosty ground. The sound barely faded before children began appearing, running, walking, and skipping toward the schoolhouse from every direction. Clara's heart swelled as she watched them approach. Martha Peterson's yellow hair ribbons bounced as she hurried. Alongside Little Hawk, Nia's granddaughter, their heads bent close in conversation. Behind them, Tommy Barnes helped young Eagle carry a stack of books, their breath-making clouds in the cold air. "Good morning, Mrs. McCrae," several voices called out. The new name still brought a smile to Clara's face, even after only 1 day of marriage. "Good morning, children," she answered warmly, ushering them inside where the pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat. Kay settled into their seats, shrugging off heavy coats and unwrapping scarves. The familiar routine felt different now, richer somehow. As if the previous day's celebration had woven new threads of understanding through the fabric of their small community. Clara moved to the front of the room, smoothing her dark wool skirt. The Bible lay open on her desk, its pages marked with a ribbon. She waited for the rustling of papers and scraping of chairs to quiet before speaking. "Today, we'll begin with a special verse," she said, her clear voice carrying to the back row. "From the book of Proverbs, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." She let the words settle in the quiet room. "Can anyone tell me what this means to them?" Little Hawk's hand rose slowly. "It means we must help those who need help, even when it's hard." Tommy Barnes nodded eagerly. "Like when you and Mr. McCrae helped Mrs. Runningbird protect the special meadow." Clara smiled gently. "Yes, that's one example. But remember, courage and truth can show themselves in small ways too. Like being kind to a new student or speaking up when you see something wrong." The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm of lessons. Clara moved between the rows, helping younger students sound out words while the older ones worked on their arithmetic. The winter sun climbed higher, sending squares of light across the plank floor through frost-edged windows. As the noon hour approached, Clara heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats outside. The children's heads turned toward the windows, and excited whispers rippled through the room. Clara glanced up to see Zeke dismounting from his bay horse, helping Nia down from her paint mare. "Time for lunch," Clara announced, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. The children quickly gathered their dinner pails, pulling on coats and mittens before spilling out into the yard. Zeke's tall figure filled the doorway as he entered, stamping snow from his boots. His dark eyes found Clara's warm with affection. Nia followed, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that steamed in the cold air. "Thought you might like some hot stew," Nia said, setting the bundle on Clara's desk. "Made with the last of the wedding venison." "That's very kind," Clara replied, touched by the gesture. She watched as Little Hawk ran up to hug her grandmother, chattering excitedly in mixed Blackfoot and English. About the morning's lessons, they shared the meal together in the schoolhouse, Clara, Zeke, and Nia, while the children played outside in the weak winter sunshine. Through the windows, Clara could see them teaching each other games, their laughter carrying clearly through the cold air. "The children seem happy," Nia observed, watching them. "They don't see the boundaries adults build." Zeke nodded his shoulder, brushing Clara's. "Maybe we could learn something from them." The afternoon lessons passed quickly, and soon Clara was watching the last students disappear down the snowy road toward home. She gathered her books and papers, wrapping herself in her heavy shawl before stepping out into the gathering dusk. Zeke waited with the horses, his breath visible in the cold air. The ride home was peaceful, their mounts' hooves making soft sounds in the fresh snow. The ranch house emerged from the darkness, lamplight glowing in its windows. Later that night, Clara stood on the wide front porch, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. The sky stretched endless above them, stars sharp and brilliant in the crystal-clear air. To the north, she could just make out the darker shape of the sacred meadow, now protected for generations to come. Zeke's footsteps sounded behind her, and then his strong arms slipped around her waist, pulling her close against the cold. The scent of wood smoke clung to his coat, mingling with the crisp smell of snow on the wind. Clara leaned into his warmth, remembering that desperate moment in the church when she'd first spoken to him. "I told you," she whispered, a smile in her voice, "you needed a wife." She felt rather than saw his answering smile as he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Standing there in the quiet night, surrounded by the land they'd fought to protect, Clara felt the last piece of her heart slide into place. This was home, not just the ranch house with its warm lights, but everything. The school full of eager faces, the sacred meadow under starlight, the bridge they'd helped build between two peoples. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying promises of snow and future seasons. Clara closed her eyes, savoring the moment. For the first time since stepping off the train into this wild territory, she felt completely, utterly at home. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.